All right, welcome to Module 16. This is the final module of this semester. Our subject is foreign policy, which has several important aspects. This is another subject where I teach an entire semester-long course, and in my opinion, it's one of the most important topics related to American government, because if we can't defend ourselves, our independence is potentially subject to serious threat. Foreign policy refers to a government's strategies, goals, and positions regarding other nations and international organizations. The scope of foreign policy includes, among other things, national defense, international trade, intergovernmental organizations with United States, United Nations, or NATO, and non-governmental actors. Several factors influence how a nation formulates and conducts foreign policy, including its size, population, geographic location, the productivity of its economy, and the effectiveness of its government. The formulation and conduct of U.S. foreign policy has evolved considerably over time, as the U.S. grew from a small and relatively weak nation to a formidable regional power and then a global superpower. Additionally, different presidential administrations have interpreted U.S. national defense and national interests differently. They tended to prioritize different issues. The end of the Cold War and the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 also, again, fundamentally changed American foreign policy priorities for a considerable period of time. In the early years of the Republic, two important ideas kind of dominated Americans' collective approach and perceptions of foreign policy. First is the idea of manifest destiny, which posited that it was foreordained that the United States would stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and most Americans believed it was a birthright to conquer the interior of North America. Additionally, in Washington's farewell address, he warned the nation against involvement in foreign wars and helped establish a tradition of isolationism in foreign policy. American isolationism was quite different than Oriental versions of isolationism prevalent for long periods in China and Korea and Japan. In those countries, isolation took the form of cultural withdrawal in the attempt to try and preserve a sense of racial or ethnic purity. And the essence of it was resisting outside influences. In the United States, isolationism was exclusively political in nature. America was, from the start, committed to international commerce and was not shy about using force to protect American merchants from foreign interference with trade. The use of force by the federal government in the service of American national interests tended to be unilateral in nature until the 20th century. In other words, we fought our own fights, but we were definitely in the world. The United States began to emerge as a regional power following the Civil War. As I mentioned in the previous presentation, we had a couple of industrial revolutions which dramatically expanded our economic power. That again had several transformational effects. First, it ended the sectional divisions between free and slaveholding regions of the country. Second, I'm talking about the Civil War here. Second, it facilitated America's industrial development. Third, the military that was developed to prosecute the Civil War wasn't entirely demobilized. Some of it was used again inwardly to pacify, to conquer the Plains Native Americans tribes and the Southwestern tribes, and to consolidate federal control over the middle of the country. And fourth, America began to use its modern and powerful Navy to extend its power in Central and Latin America and in Asia. The United States was acknowledged as a global power following the Spanish-American War of 1898, where the United States quickly and thoroughly defeated Spain and secured independence for Cuba, and seized the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and other territories from Spain. From there, various conflicts have influenced the formulation and conduct of American policy, including, we'll talk about in turn, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and then, of course, the War on Terror, which involved us invading and occupying Iraq and Afghanistan. World War I began in 1914 as a conflict between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire on one side, and an alliance comprised of England, France, and Russia on the other side. The United States maintained neutrality for 3 years, but the administration of Woodrow Wilson quickly became convinced the United States would eventually be compelled to enter the war. And Wilson actually commissioned what was known at the time as the Committee on Public Information, in an attempt to overcome Americans' commitment to isolationism and shift public opinion in support of U.S. entrance into the war. Germany's sinking of the British ship Lusitania, in combination with an intercepted German telegram proposing a military alliance with Mexico against the United States, decisively swung public opinion in favor of U.S. entrance into the war in 1917. The horrors of World War I, which included human wave attacks, trench warfare, machine guns, chemical weapons, contributed to, kind of just a general abhorrence of war and to an idealistic attempt to abolish war as a tool of statecraft. To that end, American President Woodrow Wilson led calls for a League of Nations organized around the principle of collective security, in which an attack on one member state would draw all member states to the attacked nation's defense. While many nations joined the League of Nations, the United States rejected ratification of the Treaty of Versailles, which included the provisions for the League of Nations. Meanwhile, the harsh reparations against Germany by the victorious Allies sowed the seeds for the next war. The period between 1920 and 1939, which is the onset of World War II, or the formal onset of World War II, were known historically as the interwar years. The United States swung back into an isolationist, kind of non-aligned stance, and in the absence of international leadership, a number of countries were taken over by authoritarian movements, collectively kind of known as fascism, which seized upon the grievances against outsiders to promote racist justifications for conquering lesser peoples. Particularly the nations of Italy, Germany, and Japan, known as the Axis powers. Those fascist countries began in the early 1930s to make unrealistic or unreasonable territorial demands on neighboring countries. Germany and the Soviet Union's invasion and partition of Poland in 1939 led to kind of the formal onset of World War II. Again, the United States remained uncommitted at the outset of the war, but clearly favored the Allied powers of Great Britain and France, and of course also the Soviet Union to a lesser extent. Likewise, the U.S. began using economic sanctions to punish the Japanese for its invasion of China in 1937. An oil embargo imposed on Japan caused the Japanese military leadership to commit to a devastating assault on the U.S. Pacific Fleet. And on December 7, 1941, the Japanese Imperial Navy launched a series of air attacks on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The Japanese hoped to catch the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor, but the carriers were out. Nevertheless, the Japanese sunk or severely damaged 8 battleships and killed over 2,400 Americans, which led to the very quick U.S. entrance into the war. And again, the tide, the U.S. was very quickly able to turn the tide, and they were able to successfully wage a two-front war and defeat all of the Axis powers. The successful prosecution of the war changed the U.S. approach to foreign policy in profound ways. First and foremost, the public commitment to isolationism evaporated and was replaced by a commitment to multilateralism, where the use of international regimes and regional alliances to pursue U.S. defense and advance the national security, the national interests. Key to America's commitment to multilateralism included the creation of the United Nations, which replaced the League of Nations, and again was conceived as a forum for international cooperation and the diplomatic management of conflicts. As an approach to managing conflict, multilateralism has had a mixed record. On the one hand, multilateral institutions did manage to prevent the outbreak of another generalized conflict between the United States and the USSR. But on the other hand, growing tensions between the US and the Soviet Union prevented international organizations like the United Nations from effecting more thoroughgoing, peace enforcement. A second major change to the U.S. approach to foreign policy was the establishment of major regional military alliances. The first such alliance was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was formed in 1949 to counter the growing military threat posed by the Soviet Union to Western Europe. The Soviet Union had, in the aftermath of World War II, seized much of Eastern Europe and forced those countries into the Soviet sphere of influence. The Soviets also attempted to isolate Berlin, which at the time, was occupied by the Allied powers, but which was more than 90 miles inside of East Germany, which was occupied by the Soviets. The Berlin airlift, which involved an unprecedented use of air power to drop supplies into the country, frustrated the Soviet Union's efforts, and contributed to the Soviet construction of the Berlin Wall to seal off Soviet-controlled Berlin from the rest of the city, and stood from 1961 until 1989. Most historians view sort of the Berlin blockade and airlift as the beginning of the Cold War, which was an ideological conflict beginning between the West and, led by the United States and the Soviet Union and its allies. That led to the doctrine of containment, which was first articulated by President Harry Truman in 1948 in announcing support for anti-communist insurgencies in Turkey and Greece, and called for the prevention of expanding Soviet influence throughout the world. Commitment to the doctrine of containment drew the United States into two major conflicts and a lot larger number of minor conflicts. In 1950, North Korea's invasion of South Korea led to the first use of the United Nations as a peacekeeping institution, which was made possible by the Soviet Union's boycott of the UN Security Council. Its leadership believed that by not attending, the Security Council lacked a quorum to act. The rest of the Security Council disagreed. U.S. success in defeating North Korean forces in South Korea and Douglas MacArthur's decision to invade North Korea drew Chinese intervention, with both sides engaging, and the Soviet Union supporting the Chinese, with both sides engaging in costly attacks and counterattacks that resulted in a bloody stalemate and led to the establishment of a demilitarized zone between the North and South portions of Korea that remains in the eyes of most U.S. military strategists as the one place in the world where the U.S. could be drawn into a war not of its choosing. Nearly 3 million people were killed over the 4 years of the Korean conflict, with a majority of them being civilians. The United States lost over 54,000 soldiers. Chinese and North Korean casualties may have exceeded 500,000. The U.S. was also drawn into a conflict in Southeast Asia. Vietnam, which had also been partitioned between a North and South versions following the defeat of Japanese occupying forces after World War II, was reoccupied as a French colonial possession, which led to an insurgency supported by the pro-communist North Koreans. Following the defeat of the French occupying forces in Vietnam in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the U.S. took over in preventing South Vietnam from being taken over by the North, with the U.S. sending at first small contingents of military advisors to support the training of South Vietnam's military forces. They were called the ARVN forces. In 1964, the administration of Lyndon Johnson Americanized the war, committing up to 600,000 troops to wage a conventional war. Several massive air bombing campaigns caused massive casualties among the North Vietnamese population. Ultimately, U.S. attempts to defeat the North Korean army really failed because U.S. military strategists, I think, misunderstood the nature of the war. They viewed the war primarily through ideological lenses, thinking that the war was part of a larger struggle against communism. But the Vietnamese understood or believed that they were fighting a civil war, and most Vietnamese viewed the South Vietnamese regime as basically a regime of outsiders being supported by outsiders. And that meant that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong always had a recruiting advantage. The U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam and the resulting takeover of the country by communists caused a great deal of soul searching among American political elites. The U.S. abandoned the idea of a military draft and moved to an all-volunteer force in the mid-1970s. Following the Vietnam conflict, the U.S. was more circumspect in its use of military force until the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s, which unleashed new forces and generated new threats to U.S. national security. From 1989 until 2001, U.S. foreign policy focused on expanding human rights protections and democratic governance internationally. That period also coincided the emergence of Islamic fundamentalist movements in the Middle East, which began with the Iranian Revolution in 1979. The Cold War's end unleashed conflicts between Sunni and Shiite Muslims that had previously been sort of suppressed by the Cold War. The Soviet occupation of Afghanistan also led to the creation of Al-Qaeda, which was also in the same year. The Al-Qaeda is an Arabic term meaning the base. Al-Qaeda embraces an ideological extreme version of Sunni Islam, calling for a return of the Caliphate, an Islamic empire that ruled much of Western Asia, the Middle East, Northern Africa, and Spain for much of the high period of the Middle Ages. Al-Qaeda adherents condemn the West basically for being, for supporting Middle Eastern dictatorships and for being culturally and morally decayed in their view. The leader of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, planned and coordinated the September 11, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And as a result of those attacks, the administration of George W. Bush called for a war on terrorism, and in the process articulated the Bush Doctrine, which reserved the right to preemption, to attack any nation harboring terrorist organizations that might be thinking about attacking the U.S. In fighting the global war on terrorism, the Bush administration invaded and occupied Afghanistan, driving the fundamentalist Taliban regime out of power, and they were the ones that were sheltering Al-Qaeda at the time. Subsequently, the Bush administration then invaded and occupied Iraq on the grounds that the authoritarian regime of Saddam Hussein was seeking to develop weapons of mass destruction. No WMD was ever discovered, and the occupation quickly turned into a bloody insurgency that destabilized the Middle East and contributed to political unrest in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Syria, and other places, a process known as the Arab Spring. The U.S. occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq failed to secure U.S. strategic objectives and became economically and politically costly investments in U.S. blood and treasure. Last year, the Biden administration withdrew the last troops from Afghanistan in a move that probably hurt his approval ratings. Okay, I think I've given you a basic overview of American foreign policy from a historical perspective. There's still a lot of ground to cover, including the major bureaucratic agencies that comprise the foreign policy establishment, like the Department of Defense, the State Department, and the agencies that form the intelligence community. As always, if there's anything in this chapter or the chapter on domestic policy you don't understand, please don't hesitate to contact me or ask questions in your weekly discussion. On a closing note, I hope you enjoyed this course. More importantly, I hope you learned a lot about American federal government. I always love teaching this course and explaining to students why politics and government are so important. I hope you leave this class with a better appreciation of the necessity of politics and the importance of effective and accountable government. Thanks for being here.